All right. We'll be there in a minute. So it's really interesting uh, as we get into this questioning. The Gospels have Jesus going to Caiaphas, but John has him going to Annas. So there's a little bit of a controversy there. And because of that, I had to pull John into this a little bit. So I didn't have much choice. Because when you start talking about this is a very controversial point with scholars. Where did Jesus go first? To who did he go first? And John's real specific that he was led to Annas first. He was a father-in-law of Caiaphas. And I'm going to bring this up. I got a slide coming up that's going to help explain this. So I'm not going to go into it in detail here. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. We believe that's John himself. This is John's gospel. We believe it's John who was able to get into the court of the high priest, and it's because of John that Peter was able to get into the court. Peter was standing at the door outside, so the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out, spoke to the doorkeeper, and brought Peter in. Then the slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, You are not also one of the man's disciples, are you? And he said, I am not. Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves. Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples, about his teaching. Jesus answered, I've spoken openly to the world. I taught in the synagogues and the temple. I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. And he said, when he had said this, one of the officers standing struck Jesus, saying, Is that the way you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered, If I've spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? And Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas. Now, okay. So Jesus was first brought bound for Annas. John is very specific here, but they find it difficult to reconcile with the Synoptics. The problem is Annas and Caiaphas are both referred to in the Bible as high priests, but you can only have one high priest. Right? There's only one high priest. He's the one that goes into the Holy of Holies, only one. And that high priest is supposed to be the direct descendant of Aaron, right? Aaron is a high priestly tribe. So it should have been a direct descendant of Aaron. You used to only have one high priest, and high priests in the Old Testament served until they died. When they died, then their son took over their position as high priest. But by the time of Jesus in the Roman world, this had become very political. If you've ever been over to that part of the world, which I have now actually, in those houses, there's huge courtyards in the really expensive houses, and they're gated. There's walls around them, and you got to go in, and that's what they're talking about here, is this courtyard that he had to go into. And John, apparently there was a slave girl keeping the door, and John, he apparently was the one we believe was inside that was able to get Peter in because he was known to the high priest. But this is where we have kind of a little bit of a hiccup. So Annas was appointed high priest by the legate Quirinius in AD 6. So that's quite a bit before where we're at now because we're probably around 27 to 30 AD. So approximately at the same time, Archelaus, the Ithanarch, was removed from office and sent into exile. Now, Archelaus was one of the descendants of Herod, okay? He didn't last long as a ruler. So basically what happened was in this time is that when the Romans, like you had a king like Herod, who really wasn't a king. He was a king by appointment of Herod. He wasn't like we think, like a king of lineage. When you had a king like Herod, he had three of his descendants we call the tetrarch. And all those guys inherited land, or inherited a piece of land that they were kings over when Herod died. But if those kings weren't favored upon by the Romans, I don't know how else to put that, if the Romans didn't like them for whatever reason, then the Romans would dispose of them. And then when they did that, instead of putting another what we would call a king in place, they would put what we would call a governor, is the best word I think we would have for that. Sometimes that's what Felix and Festus, that's what those guys were, okay? Procurators, they called them. We would probably call them a governor. And that's what Pontius Pilate was. That's how come there wasn't a king. So when we get to this part of the Bible, and you're going to see Jesus going before Herod. That's Herod Antipas, okay? That's not Herod Agrippa. That's Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas was the king over the region, including Galilee. He was in Jerusalem for the feast. He wasn't king over Judea, okay? Pilate was the procurator over Judea. The reason they took him before Herod was because Jesus was a Galilean, okay? So if that kind of helps a little bit, because it's very confusing in here. But the high priest, he, at this time, was appointed by the Romans, okay? He wasn't like was in the Old Testament, because you got to remember, the Romans were trying to control the Jews. How better do you control the Jews than to control the leader of the Jews? The leader of the Jews at this time was the high priest, all right? So the office had become very political. Now, that's the legalistic side of this. Now, for a minute, consider the religious side of the implication here. The high priest went into the Holy of Holies once a year to make atonement for the sins of the people. If the high priest wasn't the right high priest, wasn't cleansed with the blood, when he went into the Holies of Holies, according to the Old Testament, God would strike him dead, right? God would strike him dead. There's a lot of religious here that points to the idea that God had departed from the temple. The ark wasn't there anymore. And this kind of backs that up, because these guys who weren't really the right guys were able to go into the Holy of Holies, and God didn't strike them dead. So it kind of lends to that idea that God had, of course God's everywhere, but you got to work with me here. That God had, in Jewish thought, God existed in the Holy of Holies, right? That's where God rested. That's what temples were, resting places for gods. All right, I've talked about that a little bit. I think it's very fascinating. We're not temple people, right? We're not temple people. Temples were built for gods to rest in. So in that society, and so in Judaism, God rested in the Holy of Holies. That was a place for God to rest. And God wasn't there because the high priest, who wasn't really the high priest, was able to go in and give the sacrifice, and he didn't die. So there's religious implications here, and there's political implications here. So normally Annas would have held that office for life, but Valerius Gratus, Pilate's predecessor, these guys never stayed very long. They always seemed to fall out of favor. So in AD 15, he basically took him out of that. He found him intolerable. So Annas simply became the power behind the throne of his son-in-law Caiaphas and 5 other family members who also held that position. Brown is undoubtedly correct in concluding that although it was unusual, Annas was still called high priest because Josephus had no difficulty. So Josephus, I talked some about Josephus, but Josephus was a Jew, but when the Romans went to take Jerusalem, Josephus aligned himself with the Romans. That's why we call him Josephus Flavius. Okay, if you see his stuff, it's Josephus Flavius, because Josephus basically was a Jew, and he was a Jewish historian, but he aligned himself with the Romans. That's how he survived the destruction of Jerusalem. All right? And he was a historian of the day, and was not a Christian. Did mention Christ in some of his writings, but was not a Christian. Described events which he was involved long after being disposed. Therefore, no reason to think that Annas would not be involved in such a hearing as some scholars have thought, even though a few manuscripts sought to alter the presence of such an early hearing before Annas. But these are later attempts at a necessary harmonization. The statement that Caiaphas was high priest that year did not mean to suggest the high priesthood changed every year, okay? What it meant is that at the time that this went on, technically, Caiaphas was high priest. But they both are referred to as high priest, okay? Which really isn't right, but that's how it is. Does that make any sense? Yeah, same way where you'd say, yeah, he's president, but he's really not anymore. I don't guess they say he's a previous president, generally. They just say President of the United States, right? So kind of the same idea. But in Judaism, it should have never occurred, because technically you only have one high priest. When he dies, you have another high priest. And it's kind of confusing in the Gospels, because you see Caiaphas high priest, Annas is high priest. You see. So so we get into the Gospels now, we go to Caiaphas. Okay? Why that is, I don't know. This is what people argue about. But I don't think it's anything to argue about. John included a lot of things that the Synoptics didn't feel necessary to include, and I don't think that there's any reason to not harmonize this. And I'm not sure that they're not even technically about in the same place. So I just think here we start with the Gospels. In Luke, it says they led him away to the high priest. In Matthew, it says they seized Jesus, led him away to Caiaphas, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. Peter was following him at the courtyard of the high priest. He was sitting with officers, warming himself at the fire. See, John is the only one that really talks about somebody getting Peter into the court. John's perspective was a little bit different here than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You got to remember at this particular point, Matthew, we only have Matthew here, right? The other two, Mark and Luke, are not apostles, right? Right? So we only have Matthew that's an apostle, and all the apostles fled. So Matthew's not even there, more than likely. Yeah, so I don't know where he's at. And you got Mark, who's John Mark, and Luke, who wrote basically off of Peter's account, I believe, at this point. Neither one of them were an apostle. Neither one of them were directly really involved in what was going on here. So John's perspective is an apostle that followed Jesus all the way to the cross. John's perspective is a lot stronger here than these writers. So, and that's what we see. If you notice Luke, he talks about Peter. I think Luke's perspective, because Luke's writing this in third person, right? So he's writing, and Luke, if you follow Luke's writings, he's mainly talking about Peter. Even in the first part of Acts, it's Peter, 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 right? Peter on the day of Pentecost, Peter in Jerusalem for the high priest, Peter being arrested, Peter before Cornelius, Peter, 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 till we get to about Acts 9, where all of a sudden Paul comes into the picture. Then it becomes predominantly Paul, right? But Luke's writing from the other perspective. Other people's writing in the third person, right? So is John Mark. So, Matthew's closer, but then again, all the apostles fled. So Matthew isn't as close to this as John. John's closer, if that helps. So he comes before them. Now, this council here is probably the Sanhedrin. So this is the Jewish court. And so Jesus is arguing before them. This is the same council that Paul will argue before. in the book of Acts. Paul argued before, basically the same idea. They wanted to put him to death. So, what would they have to prove? This is Jewish law. What would you have to prove under Jewish law to kill Jesus? Yeah, blaspheme, right? In other words, you can't just, you have to prove that he says, I am God. That's a pretty big thing, right? You have to prove that he says, I am God. Blaspheme. So that's what they have to prove. Jesus, how often did Jesus say that? Never really said it, did he? He never really said, I'm God, did he? He said it indirectly in a lot of ways. He says, I'm like God. If you've seen me, you've seen God. That's not saying I'm God, right? It's not the same thing. The Son of God, right? So yeah, it's really iffy legal ground here, right? It says they came forward, so this man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Which really isn't, they kept trying to put him to death. They were not finding any. Their testimony was not consistent. Under the law of Moses, you had to have 2 witnesses, right? 2 witnesses under the law of Moses. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands. Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. So basically, they're having a hard time, they're having a hard time finding. They don't want to just arrest him. They don't want to just beat him, right? They want to kill him. So, and they're not really allowed to do that. So, this is pretty tough ground. And what Jesus is doing, he's really not answering, right? Jesus kept silent. This really is Isaiah 53. Like a lamb before his shears is silent, did not open his mouth. This really fits into the prophecy of Isaiah 53. They didn't do it. Of course, in Matthew, it says, and in Mark, it says, you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said, you said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his robes, and he says he's blasphemed. What further need do we have? He deserves death. You've heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? So, of course, this was a rigged trial. We all know that. This is how we're going to get rid of Jesus, how we're going to take care of this problem. I always think it's fascinating to me that, if you could, I wish they could see it now, right? I wish they could see this now, the way we see it now, and realize that they caused the problem, right? I mean, they were trying to stop the problem, but if they could see it now, they would realize they're the ones who caused the whole problem. I mean, if Jesus hadn't died on the cross, rose from the grave, it wouldn't have mattered, right? And I think it's fascinating in life how I've done this many times in my life. I've done things and I thought, well, that's going to solve the problem, and I made a bigger problem. You ever done that? I have. You need to live the life of Rex for a while. I've done that 1,000 times. I'm going to fix this, and then I make some bigger problem that I'm 4 days trying to fix a bigger problem made that I should have just left it alone. It's that old thing that says if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's a lot of truth in that statement right there. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But they caused the problem, right? Do what? Oh, yeah, it had to happen. Yeah, it was foreordained, but there's a lot of this that's very ironic. I think when they're outside Pilate's temple saying, his blood be on us and on our children, I think, how prophetic is that, right? But it wasn't just the trial, right? It was the mocking, to spit on him, to beat him, to blindfold him and say, "Who hit you, right? Who hit you?" Uh, the high priest condemned him, deserving death, began to spit on him, to blindfold him, to beat him with their fists. The officers received him with slaps in the face. So, this is just the beginning, isn't it, of how bad this is going to get, just the beginning. Peter was below in the courtyard. Seeing Peter warming himself, said, "You are the one, Jesus the Nazarene." He denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about." This is really, I think, what we're talking about in John's gospel, where he went into the courtyard of Annas, but I think it was. But I think here we're in Caiaphas' courtyard. I'm not sure we're talking about two different courtyards necessarily, because they're both high priests. We are both before the council, so it's realistic for him to be before both these guys. The servant girl saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, "This is them," but he denied it. A little later, another saw him. You too are one of them. This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. I don't know what Galileans look like compared to Judeans. They're all Jews, but apparently somehow people knew when they were Galileans. I guess it's like being from down south and you say y'all. People know you're from down south, I guess. I don't know. But people knew they were Galileans. So that kind of put them in this category. So it says, after a little while, the bystanders were again saying to Peter, "Surely you are one, for you are a Galilean." And he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you are talking about." Do you think it got easier for Peter to deny him every time he did it? I don't know. This is the same guy who just a little bit ago said, "I'm going to lay down my life for you," right? "I'm going to die for you." Just hours before this, said that very thing. Why didn't he? What changed? Got fearful? Part of the plan? Yeah. I think it just went wrong for everybody right here. I can't help that. I know people don't agree with me on that a lot, but I think Jesus tried to tell them how bad this was going to go. But man, when you don't want to believe something, it don't matter how much somebody tries to convince you. You just ain't going to turn, are you? Yeah, he will. And I think when they came and got Jesus and Jesus just went, I just think they were crushed. I think Judas didn't expect it to go that way. I know Judas didn't expect it to go that way. And I think that Peter had a sword out. He was ready, right? This is going to turn right here. We're ready to go to war. And Jesus said, "I'll put that away." Healed the slave's ear. I think Peter was confused. Don't you? I think he was confused. I think they were all confused. What's this mean? What's going to happen? This was Jesus' agony. I'm going to talk about that in my sermon this morning, actually. But this was Jesus' agony to me. More than the cross, more than the beating, more than the scourging, more than the slapping, the spitting. The agony of Christ was having to go through this alone. I mean, having to go through this, wanting, I think, to wanting to make them understand that are closest to you, and yet knowing that they're not going to understand. That's the agony here for Christ. Peter denied him, didn't they all? Didn't they all deny him, essentially? John was in the courtyard. I didn't see John standing up in his defense, did you? I mean, yeah. I think it was just, I don't know how to answer that. I think, are we just human? I mean, are we just flesh and blood? I mean, I think the agony of Christ was all the way to his soul. You know, I think it was one of those things that I think on a God level, he knew. I mean, he knew they were going to be scattered. He said they were. I mean, he said that in John. He says they're going to be scattered. You know, the shepherd's going to be stricken, the sheep are going to be scattered. I mean, he knew it was going to happen. He knew they were going to. He knew they were going to flee. He knew they were going to deny him. But I think, in the actuality of it, I think that's a different thing. You know, to be alone, I think was maybe his greatest agony. Fearing for them too, I think, but it was a tough time. They all denied him. Nobody was really with him. The women were following him because nobody cared about them. I mean, they could do it, right? If it had been the men, it was going to be different for them. They were going to be held accountable, you know. So I think even on the way to the cross, and I'll talk about that a little, kind of the Catholic view of that a little bit. You know, the Via Dolorosa, right? Way of the cross. Yeah, Bill. Yeah, that was probably the deity side of it. Even God having, you know, basically turned away from him. But you know, they talk about the women ministering to him, the women on the way, on the road. You got to remember, this is a crowd, right? By now, this is a crowd. And, you know, he's in the middle of a mob that hates him. And, and I just think that this is just the worst hour. We're early in the morning now, so a lot of this we think took place maybe before daylight. Now we're early in the morning. When we know they did, they arrested him after dark. And then it says, when it was day, they assembled, led him to the council. If you are the Christ, tell us. He said, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, yes, I am. So one time now, he's going to answer, right? Seal his condemnation. And they said, what further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. So this continues, this trial, this mock trial. It continues. Now we're going to shift to Judas. Judas didn't wait, did he, for the crucifixion? When he saw he was condemned, Matthew says, he felt remorse, returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests. I've sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to that yourself. And he threw the piece of silver into the temple sanctuary and departed and went away and hanged himself. See, to me, that's what really speaks volumes about Judas. If Judas had just been in it for the money, he had the money, right? If he hadn't cared, why didn't he just leave? Why didn't he just go and do what Judas does, right? I got to throw this at you because it's so funny. And it's this Jewish tradition about Judas. There's this folk tale, let's call it that. There's this folk tale about Judas that says when Judas betrayed Jesus, he went back to his house and his wife was cooking a chicken or something and the chicken came back to life, right? Now, that's kind of funny. But Judas, and that kind of made Judas like rethink what he did. I think it's kind of funny. Anyway, so, but Judas, why did he feel remorse? Isn't that what he wanted to happen? I mean, if he took the 30 pieces of silver to betray him, didn't think they were going to condemn him to death? I don't think they were going to, isn't this what he was paid for? Knew the truth. Yeah, he knew It didn't go like he wanted. Like I said, I really believe Judas thought he would force his hand, and he didn't. I wish he would have waited a while. Don't you? Do you think do you think there was salvation for Judas? So let me rephrase the question. If Judas had stayed around till after Pentecost, after the church, do you think there was salvation for Judas? Yeah, Judas left too early. I think we give Judas a hard rap, and maybe he deserves that. But Judas quit too early. Judas was part of a plan, and I wish that Judas had. I wish Judas had stayed around. If he would have just not killed himself, if he would have just hung around till after all this got done, till after Jesus was raised, and after we had a church, and after we had a way back, don't you think that Judas? Don't you think there was salvation for Judas? No, if he would have not died, if he would have stayed alive, if he would have just waited a while, Judas quit too quick, right? If Judas made a bad mistake, it was that Judas quit too quick. He should have hung around, but he didn't, and that was prophetic too, right? So they bought Potter's Field, and even today, in a lot of towns and places, we have Potter's Field, right? We call it Potter's Field. That's why. There's a burial place for strangers, Field of Blood, Oklahoma. Was fulfilled, right? Took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for Potter's Field as the Lord directed me. So even that was prophetic. But I think Judas is, there's a lot more to Judas than we know, I believe. I would really like to know what was inside Judas's head. But unfortunately, we're never going to exactly know that. Are there any comments? No, essentially he didn't kill him. He betrayed him. He handed him over, right? And Peter denied him, and Peter found forgiveness. And there was forgiveness for Judas. Judas just didn't wait to find it, Probably in some ways, maybe Judas is one of the greatest lessons of the whole Bible. I mean, in a lot of ways. But we don't talk much about him because he's kind of that guy, He's always going to be that guy. So, just how it is. So we've done our religious trials. Now we got to get him before the Romans, right? If we're going to kill him, we got to get him before the Romans. Pontius Pilate is the man. Governor, procurator of Judea. Binding Jesus, letting away to Pilate. The governor, we call him here. Pilate's in a spot. I would have hated to have been him. I'll be honest about it. He was in a tough place. You got to remember the Jews controlled Jerusalem. Jews are going to have a revolt not too many years after this. They're going to try to take Jerusalem back. There's a lot of very militant Jews, the Zealots, okay? So the peace in Jerusalem is really dependent upon the Jews because Jerusalem is very predominantly Jewish. by the high priest. And the Romans always knew this. And the Romans spent tons of money trying to keep the Jews peaceful. That's why they rebuilt the temple, right? That's why Herod rebuilt the temple, because Herod didn't care about the temple, and Herod really didn't care about the Jews, but he wanted to keep them happy. And so that's why he built this temple. Very, very sensitive peace in Jerusalem. And Pilate's in the middle of that. On one hand, he's Roman. He's got the Romans, the law. On the other hand, he's trying to keep peace. He's governor. Part of his job is to keep peace in Judea, peace in Jerusalem. He's in a really hard place. Pilate questioned him. Do you not answer sin? And he charged him and brought against you. The only real charge that they can really throw against Jesus in a Roman sense is really what in Luke. Misleading our nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, which we know that's not true. He's the one that said, give unto Caesar what's Caesar's. In saying that he himself is Christ, a king. So that's really the only thing they can say. And Pilate says, are you king of the Jews? And I don't think Pilate really cared if Jesus was king of the Jews. And he says, as you say. And Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. So this should be over. But you got to remember, we're in Jerusalem. And the Jews are pushing. He did not answer in regard to a single charge, so the governor was quite amazed. He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee. He learned he belonged to Herod. This is Herod Antipas. He's Galilean. Jurisdiction was a big thing. He's in Jerusalem for the Passover. So, okay, so he's Herod's problem, so I'm going to send him to Herod Antipas. And we'll let Herod, because he's Judean, we'll let Herod worry about it, right? So they led him from Caiaphas to the Praetorium. It was early, and they wouldn't enter because, now this is John. I had to bring John in. I know we're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but when you get to this point in this story, it's really hard not to include John a little bit. This is the same place. This is Pilate's Hall, but John gives a little better idea. It's a Praetorium. They won't go in because if they went into the house of a Gentile, they would be unclean. So what Pilate's doing in the courtyard, the Jews are in the street. And so they're getting this relayed back and forth. They're not in there with him, okay, because they would be unclean. You got to put this picture. I always have to put this picture in my mind. You know, all the Jews are outside. Oh, we can't go in, right? And Jesus is inside this Praetorium. And he said, you know, judge him yourself, but we can't put him to death. We get this in John. Therefore, fulfilling what Jesus spoke, signify what kind of death he was to die. John 12:28, right, I think. If I'm lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. So Jesus said, what kind of death? And that's why John brings this back in. This kind of goes along with my sermon this morning. So, in the word of the Lord, what kind of death? Therefore Pilate entered again the Praetorium, summoned Jesus. He said, are you king of the Jews? The reason I brought John is because I love how John words this better than anybody else. Jesus, you don't get this in the Synoptics. And Jesus said, are you saying this on initiative or did others tell you about me? And I thought that was really snarky, right? And Jesus doesn't get snarky a lot. He does a little bit. But I thought this was really a snarky comment, kind of sarcastic, right? Did somebody tell you or did you figure that out on your own, right? And I always thought that was kind of a neat insight into Jesus right there. And he says, I'm not a Jew. And Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. And this is the reason I brought in John. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting. But my kingdom is not of this realm. This statement that I'm no threat to Romans, no threat to you. And Pilate said, so you are a king? And Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. And that's one thing I love about John. You just don't get this. One of the few places where Jesus really says, yeah, I am a king. For this I have been born. For this I have come into the world to testify the truth. Everyone is of the truth, hears my voice. And Pilate says, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews, because you got to remember the Jews are out in the street, right? And Pilate's like walking back and forth. So he was back out to the Jews, and he says, I find no guilt in him. Thanks for your time this morning. We'll continue. Actually, is next weekend Memorial Day weekend? I get so confused on dates. Okay, I will not be here next Sunday, so Sunday after next we will continue. All righty.